Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about different ways that Shadowlands would be better than Battle for Azeroth. Now I know Shadowlands has a bit of skepticism behind it. After a couple expansions in World of Warcraft, people generally have skepticism about the next expansion. Is it going to be as good as Blizzard say, and can they really deliver? But because Shadowlands isn't fully out, I can't make this video called how it is going to be better. But from what Blizzard told us so far, and with a couple different updates happening on the alpha, I feel like it's a good time to talk about how it could be or how it would be better if we were to go by what Blizzard is trying to tell us about Shadowlands itself. I feel like some of these things could be agreed upon because they're very basic. It's not something specific that Shadowlands does in most cases, but something that isn't there from BFA. We're going to start with number one, and a lot of you guys, I think, will be excited about this. No more Azerite gear. Don't get me wrong, Azerite gear was an interesting idea that had a rough start. I would say the final iteration of Azerite gear and all the different choices we have by the last patch isn't the worst system ever. If BFA started with how 8.3 came out with cloaks and essences and Azerites, I feel like we would have had a pretty comprehensive system, but the rough start definitely put a bad taste in people's mouth. I love the customization of Azerite gear and the variety of different builds that we were able to come through and create, how different builds work in PvP or PvE, and how certain specs are defined by some of these passives. And we'll most likely see these passives maybe come back for Shadowlands because they are class defining. But in Shadowlands it is going to be nice to no longer have Azerite gear for your shoulders, helm, and chest. First of all, there's a couple of ways that Azerite could have been done better. For example, why do traits have to be locked into one spec? What if you had one set of Azerite gear for like dungeons, and if you went, let's say, Frost Death Knight, then all your traits switch to Frost or a Frost preset that you had. You swap to Unholy. What if you had a preset for that piece of gear to swap to unholy pieces, but still keep it relevant to the dungeon scene? I feel like something like that would have been better instead of having like 6 or 9 different sets of gear in your bags just because you want to do PvP, PvE, dungeons, raids, AoE, single target, play this spec and that spec. You have to have so many different sets of same gear in order just to be able to play all these specs at a moment's notice. Another thing they could have done is they maybe could have made it so you could change traits on the fly, kind of like how you could change your talents, but also your essences. At least being able to change your traits would have made more sense and would have saved a lot of bag space. So because of all that mess not being present in Shadowlands, I feel like that's going to feel pretty great. We don't know what Blizzard is going to do, if they're going to bring back tier sets or what kind of other systems they're going to have on top of the Kyrian as well as other Covenant abilities. But not having to deal with the mess that is Azerite gear and the bad parts of Azerite gear, I feel like it's going to be a nice breath of fresh air. Number 2 on my list, class abilities that are key to gameplay are going to be making a comeback. And this is why I feel like it's going to be really good for classes in Shadowlands, because how can a class be good, or let's say how can a class be wanted inside of groups, with balancing always being an issue that World of Warcraft has always suffered in. You know, the situations where, let's say you play a Warlock and nobody wants to take you into keys because you're not the meta right now. Everyone wants Demon Hunters and Rogues because they're better built for it. But what could Blizzard do for Warlocks without having to do the whole balancing fiasco that could still make people want to bring Warlocks into the groups? It's simple. You gotta make sure that your class, not just spec, brings something others don't. Let's take a look at Balanced Druids, for example. I feel like they're probably the best example in this situation, at least within Mythic Plus dungeons. Balanced Druids are interesting because they aren't really AoE gods like some of the other classes, and they can do good single target damage sometimes, but they're not really like designed to obliterate things like a Demon Hunter would be. But the reason why people want to bring him into keys, for pushing in particular, is because of all the different knickknacks that they bring into a group. Like Innervate for a healer, which will make it so that for 10 seconds, your healer will not have their mana spent when they're casting spells, allowing them to get some very powerful heals without wasting any mana. Abilities like Typhoon to control mobs, or Roots to keep them in place. You even have a Blanket Silence in a small area with Solar Beam, which if used right, can lock down a group for quite a bit of time and make sure no powerful casts are going out. You have some big cooldowns, but only essentially during Incarnation. So once every, 2.4 minutes right now is, with Vision of Perfection, Boomkits have some viable damage, but really outside of that, it's kind of flat. And you also have trees that you can use talent into that will peel adds away from the tank. Particularly good on weeks that are necrotic or grievous to give your tank a breathing room. And then of course you have the ability of Soothe to deal with enraging adds. So overall, that is a lot of things that a balanced druid brings just by themselves. Even if their damage is subpar or even if they're never top damage, they still do a lot inside of the dungeon. And that's one of the best things happening in Shadowlands, is Blizzard giving certain utilities to classes that will be beneficial for groups, depending on what type of content you do. For example, Death Knights are getting Anti-Magic Zone, which is normally a PvP talent, but it reduces your parties, whoever is under that Anti-Magic Zone, magic damage by a hefty number. Anti-Magic utility for dungeons and raids. That's awesome. Now more of a reason for people to want to bring Death Knights for raids or dungeons. Paladins get auras. That, again, even more utility for raids, even if you bring more than one paladin, because that's more auras to play with. Rogues can bring poisons, so finally if you're someone who plays Outlaw, just put on one poison, and now you can finally get some groups in PvP. Even if you're not Assassination, you bring the effective utility that a rogue should bring, the wound poison. Warlocks with curses, that's awesome. You now will be able to bring warlocks inside of dungeons, and depending on your build, a certain curse might be very, very strong in a specific fight. Balance in World of Warcraft for damage sake has never been perfect, and I think it almost will never be. Going into Shadowlands, we're still going to have balance issues. There's always going to be one class or spec that's the top of the charts, and always somebody has to take the bottom role. They can never really make it completely perfectly aligned. There's always going to be a bigger fish out there, but particularly with Shadowlands, there's certain mechanics that can justify you wanted to bring certain classes into certain groups, and I think that's going to be one of the best things that will make everybody feel like, hey, my class is wanted, there's a specific role that I do, and as long as I execute that role properly, there is utility and usefulness for me. The more of that we can have, I think, the better. Number 3, crafting powerful items with very little RNG, as you will literally get to choose which stats and effects you want. Essentially, in Shadowlands, you will be able to farm up materials to craft powerful items with, get this, specific stats and even effects if you have the right materials. If you're someone who ever done any profession crafting in Battle for Azeroth, I actually picked up leatherworking and engineering just so I can get a little bit of a heads up when it comes to crafting my engineering helm to get faster Azerite gear, but also to get myself some leather pieces like boots and pants. And the amount of times I had to re-scrap them and remake them because the stats that I get on them is completely RNG drains my wallet. It's ridiculous that, you know, when you craft a piece of gear, it gives you completely randomized stats and then you have to scrap it. And they even made it so when you scrap the item, it doesn't even reward you back majority of the important resources anymore. Like Expulsum, for example. Back in patch 8.1, I think it refunded you 100% Expulsum if you got the wrong stats, so you really had to replace a few minor pieces of leathers and hides in order to recraft that leather piece until you get the best stats. I mean, I guess that works out if the materials are very inexpensive. And for the most part, if you have quite a bit of gold on the side, and you are someone who's going to invest into professions, there's a good chance you're not going to be doing it with just 5,000 gold in your character. So you probably will be able to buy all the cheap materials and craft the pieces, but since the material is so cheap, there's a very low return on what kind of stats they might get. Sometimes you'll get your best in slot in a single go, and you'll keep them. And some other times you'll get the worst stats and you'll have to re-roll them a couple times, and that number really does stack up. But instead of having really inexpensive stats and having to re-roll gear, what if you could get expensive pieces, materials and such, specific maybe enchantments, and then craft that specific gear after working hard for those enchantments? That's essentially what's going to be happening with Shadowlands, as well. I mean, another one of the small steps to remove some parts of the RNG out of the game, and I feel like that was an unnecessary RNG. Honestly, I would rather farm up very rare material that isn't around in the game that much to then be able to craft a specific piece of gear with specific stats, rather than get my materials really cheap and have to recraft the same piece of gear over and over and over. It just made no sense whatsoever. Number 4, Shadowlands is still going to have the same big and small systems that we all like. What I mean is, Shadowlands is still going to have your raids, your arenas, your Mythic Plus keys, so that's always nice, as that majority of the people that play WoW at max level enjoy one of those 3 activities, maybe 2 of them, maybe all 3. But there will also be other smaller systems for us to play around with, like Tower of Torghast, which in a sense is the best parts of islands with the randomness, plus a little bit of that horrific vision vibe with them. It's another one of those systems that lets you have flexible composition. Anywhere between 1 to 4 people can be used in progression, and it's a great solo grind or a group activity that has you a little bit of that variety of how Blizzard described it, roguelike experience. Basically, you ascend the tower, the higher you go, the harder the enemies get. You also get a variety of different passive buffs that you get to choose from, and these buffs are different every single run. If I were to give you an example, and I don't know all the different buffs that Tower Torghast will have, but what if you had some sort of, let's say, at the first few levels that you ascend in Tower, you pick up a couple of different buffs, and you decide to go for a crit heavy build. Maybe the game is like, oh, gain 5% extra critical strike, so you pick up a couple of those. Now the game gives you some sort of other buff. Every time you crit, there's a chance you summon some sort of a powerful enemy to fight by your side instead of against you. So now you have this crit heavy build with a summoner playstyle, and as you're critting enemies left and right, you're summoning more of these, let's say, demons that spawn into the tower, and now you're building yourself up a little army. Or maybe you'll have a completely different build where, let's say, you gain yourself maximum movement speed, and every time you move, you radiate AoE damage. So in a sense, you might be able to make a build where you run circles around the enemy and kind of AoE them down just by movement, while also applying extra AoE damage. Or maybe going for a very tanky build and just letting your movement kind of take care of the enemy. Anything like that can be creative in Tower of Torghast, and there's going to be multiple different ways to deal with different situations and different builds. So the idea behind Tower of Torghast, I think, is really good, and more of those mechanics in games going forward in future patches and expansions even is never a bad idea. We've seen smaller group content like Horrific Visions, which were a massive success, and Legion Challenge Mode Tower back in the day was also a massive success. So the more of those small core systems that we can play around with, maybe even solo progression systems, even though it's an MMO, Blizzard really does have a knack for making some of the solo systems feel great and rewarding and even challenging. So the more of those we see in the game, the better, in my opinion. And number 5, finally, I'm going to put rewards that aren't just gear progression, which is going to feel very, very nice. First of all, getting loot from raids and dungeons feels great. You know, the item level grinding, going for the proper stats and trying to get your best slot trinkets, that's always fun. At least I would say the first time around. But there are other gear grind rewards, or other rewards in general from previous expansions, that are just as satisfying. For example, let's go back to Legion. Mage Tower. Let's talk about that one again. The AP weapon skin from Challenge Mode was super satisfying to earn, especially if you did it before Timur's Garrus opened, when you didn't really have the best gear. So then the tower was really, truly a real challenge. It was actually difficult, and some people had to have hundreds of pulls in it before they were able to even get close to finishing the tower and getting their skin. For my Outlaw Rogue, I ran right under 100 pulls, somewhere in the ballpark of 90 to 80, but when I was able to finally get the challenge done and I was able to do the mechanics properly, it was such a satisfying experience to put all together. It was another bit of progression that wasn't just throwing an item level at me, but rather something that I could hold in my, character's hands, something that everybody else could see. So it was very, very exciting to have something that was more a visual progression, which can be just as impactful as just flat item levels. And Shadowlands is going to be no different in that department. Blizzard decided that, yes, Covenants are going to have probably some sort of other gear progression and some other character progression in terms of power, but also the visual progression is going to be there. For example, there's going to be different mounts and even different mount skins for you to acquire, depending on what kind of activities you do. Imagine having a basic mount skin versus a very armored, more badass version looking of that same mount for killing, let's say, the hardest boss in the game on the highest difficulty. Something like that could be really, really cool to see, something you could even show off, and just something you could see on your character. Then you have the actual armors for the Covenants themselves. We don't know how we acquire them, but that might be as part of a character progression in terms of doing challenging content and unlocking pieces of that armor. Then there's also the back pieces, which are going to have unique looks. So there's so many different things that you can already see that Blizzard wants for people to work towards that are just visually impressive. Don't get me wrong, the item level grind is nice, I think the first time around or a couple times around, but it doesn't have to be the only relevant grind. And that's what I'm essentially very excited about Shadowlands, is that it's not going to be the only thing that we're to look forward to in this expansion. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm kind of enjoying just talking about all this Shadowlands stuff. I'll be honest, I'm very hyped. I'm very excited and very optimistic about how Shadowlands is going to be. I don't blame any one of you guys for being skeptic on it. I know how everybody is with expansions, but I love the fantasy with Shadowlands, the ideas behind it, and I cannot wait to see some alpha footage. I mean, so far, all the patches that was put out have been encrypted. Maybe by the time this video goes live, something will be decrypted, and of course, I'll be covering it on the channel ASAP. If you guys want to see any more Shadowlands coverage, subscribe to the channel. I don't really ask this a lot in videos, but this will be the great place to just get all the relevant information, as you know I'm going to be all over it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts, and I will see all of you in another video.